in-person event that I host here at the church. We've had a couple others at Corbell, but this is the first one we do here in our home. So welcome everyone. We're very honored to partner with the Rocky Mountain Peace and Justice Center to have Medea here. About 20 years ago, Medea received the Global Justice and Peace Award that the Denver Justice and Peace Committee gives to a activist. And so it is an honor for me to be here and get to know you in person, since I've, we all follow you. Welcome everyone. If you, just housekeeping things, if you need to go to the bathroom, just go out this door. There's 2 bathrooms right out the hallway. If in case of an emergency, please do not use the elevator. Try to go down the stairs, and if anyone needs assistance, we will help you. Not that there's going to be any emergency, but just in case. So welcome, and I will let Tom continue with the introductions, and we will be listening from him.
Hi, I'm Tom Mayer. I'm a retired professor from the University of Colorado, where I taught for over 40 years, and a longtime worker for socialism, peace, and anti-imperialism, as I said. And we're the organizers of Medea's visit to Colorado. Despite Medea's very modest presentation, she is one of the most important peace workers in the entire world. She is a penetrating intellect, a bold activist, and a very successful organizer. We're very honored to have Medea with us these 5 days.
Thank you. Well, that's quite an exaggeration, but thank you. And it does remind me that in this work that we're doing, we really need to be global, because here in the U.S., we don't have the people anymore. We had a movement at the time of Vietnam when there was a draft, and we had, the young people leading the charge. Iraq came, and raise your hands if you were in a demonstration to try to stop the war in Iraq. Well, it looks like almost all of you. And yeah, and in some ways, I was just on a webinar a couple of days ago with a group called Stop the War UK. And it's the UK coalition that has been more successful than us in getting thousands of people out on the street. And we were reflecting on the 20 years of the war in Iraq. And I said something that then they corrected me about. And I was really glad they did, because I said that one of the reasons it's very hard in the US to get people out now is not only because people are very confused about the whole war and don't understand the US role in it and all of these kind of things, but also because people came out, lots of them, around Iraq, and we were called in the New York Times the second superpower, right? People power, people all over the world coming out, and the government just went ahead and invaded Iraq anyway. And that I said I thought a lot of people became cynical from having gone out, not to just one demonstration, that big February 15, 2002, the large global demonstration. And if any of you want to see a fantastic movie about that, it's called We Are Many. And it shows the protests happening all over the world, the largest anti-war protest that ever happened in history. And, when I said I thought that was one of the reasons that made people more skeptical about getting involved in trying to stop this enormous military-industrial congressional complex when it decides it wants to make a war, is because they've tried and it hasn't worked. And when I say they corrected me, one of the other people said, well, what we found is that as a result of people going out to those demonstrations, we then had a whole new cadre of activists that were involved in all kinds of things. And I think of that because when you brought up the Occupy and how it changed your life, that there were people that came out for things like the anti-war demonstrations around Iraq, and it changed their lives. And it might be that they didn't stick just with trying to stop wars, but they got involved in environmental issues and anti-racism issues and homeless issues and poverty issues and all kinds of things. So I think that I was glad that I was corrected, because I do think whenever we manage to get people out, and somebody said you're talking to the choir, that we get ourselves revitalized. And it's not, sometimes I'm cynical about the demonstrations that we have that are on a Saturday and everything's closed and we're just walking around in a circle talking to ourselves. And then I think, yeah, but it really is good to come together. And it's good to get younger people involved. And it's good to see that we can talk about these issues and get people to know about other issues, like we're passing around the Julian Assange, and we're talking about the kind of local efforts to deal with the issues of lack of housing. So I just say this to reinforce the idea that it's important to come together, and especially after COVID, when I think that so many of us felt so isolated. And wherever I go now, people are saying our organizations are not back to where they were. It's still hard to get people out. Some people are still afraid to be in spaces with a lot of people, but other people are just used to now not coming to things. Or are they used to doing the things online, like you were saying, and that we're just starting to get back again to being in spaces together with each other, and how important that is. And it's so important when you talk about this issue of Ukraine. Since we had a chance to do what we usually don't have a chance to do, which is to kind of find out, who's in the audience, I understand that most of you are people who study these issues, people who don't rely on cable news for your information. But I'll go over some of the basics so we're sort of on the same page. I have copies of the book there that I encourage you to get hold of, and get an extra one for somebody else, pass it on. It was great before the holiday season when I was traveling around. There were people who were getting 5 books, 10 books, and said, I know this is not what my relatives want for Christmas, but it's what they're going to get. So a lot of what we still have to do 1 year after the Russian invasion is education, education, education. And, while we might be more like-minded in this group, and I don't know everybody here, it has been a difficult thing to go around the country talking about. And it's funny because I'm in the situation that is the opposite of what I'm usually in, which is I'm the protester, and yet here I am the speaker, and I get protested against in many different ways, which is absolutely fine with me. I totally welcome protest. But, some of it has been just questions from the audience that are people from the Ukrainian community. Some have been people running on stage, taking some tactics from Code Pink, grabbing the mic, and I say, go for it, And some of it has been what I don't support, which is getting me canceled, getting the talks canceled. And that happened recently in none other than the liberal city of Seattle, where I was scheduled to speak at a University of Washington bookstore. Imagine, at a university bookstore. And they canceled the talk because they said Ukrainian students had protested. And then the group had enough time to look for another space and went to the United Congregationalist Church, which is a peace church. And they said, oh, it's terrible that you were canceled. We take in rejects, so, perfect. Come here. And 3 hours before the talk was to start, they canceled.
Oh, no.
And I was on the phone with the pastor and I could not understand for the life of me. He said, we have nobody trained if there is a conflict. Nobody trained to deal with that. And I said, I've had like 50 years of dealing with that, so I think I can handle that. And the people who are organizers are also very well trained in conflict resolution. Don't worry, we can handle that. And they said, no, we're just not going to do it. And wouldn't hear, anything. And the only thing we could think of is that, maybe it was some of their donors who were objecting, whatever it is. It was a very sad thing to happen at a liberal city, a university bookstore, and then a peace church. And I just say this because it is, it is such a controversial issue. It's divided groups. It almost divided my own group, Code Pink, since we've had different opinions. And the opinions are about all kinds of things. The opinions are about we should continue sending weapons to Ukraine. The opinions go from you're criticizing Russia too much. The opinions are don't work with these groups because they don't agree with us on other issues. I mean, there's all kinds of things that we have been fighting with each other about, instead of focusing on the main issue, which is how are we going to stop people from killing each other and being killed. So when you look at this issue and you hear it from the perspective of the mainstream media, or from 95% of people in Congress, or from the White House, you will constantly hear that this invasion was unjustified and right. And so I personally, my position is that it is totally unjustified. That Russia should not have invaded. It is a crime. It's against the UN Charter. It is against our instincts for humanity and trying to find all kinds of other ways to deal with conflicts. And many of you come out of the generation that I come out of, which is the Vietnam War, and then always trying to find how do we stop wars from happening and how do we stop them once they've happened. But then to say that the provoked is just a rewriting of history or an ignorance or willful lies. So when we talk about it, there are many, many ways in which to talk about the provocations, but I think it's important to at least focus on two things. One is to say that NATO indeed should not exist. It should have fallen apart after the Soviet Union fell apart. And when there were discussions with Gorbachev about if you allow the East and West Germany to be reunified, we will promise we will not expand NATO 1 inch eastward. That was a real promise that was made. It was not a treaty because it would never have passed Congress, but it was an agreement that was made, and this idea that you could expand NATO eastward and not get a reaction from Russia is something that was warned against by all kinds of people, professors, ambassadors, policy analysts, people in the think tanks, and we talk and quote a lot of them in the book because they were saying, this is a horrible idea, don't do it, it's going to destabilize the region, Russia will have to be forced to react. And yet, that was ignored by Democrats and Republicans. So you get Clinton, who oversaw the first expansion, and then you get Bush, who continued that. And then the other way that NATO is talked about in the United States is that it's a defensive alliance. And anybody who's really dig beneath the surface of NATO understands what an aggressive military alliance it is. And that's not just looking at the bombing of Kosovo, but also NATO going way beyond the borders of North Atlantic to get involved in the invasion and occupation of Afghanistan, the overthrow of Gaddafi in Libya. And now when you look at where NATO is setting its sights, it's the same as what the US is doing, which is on China. And saying that, you know, we are fighting Russia now, but really what we have to look towards and prepare for is fighting China. So to say that it is a defensive alliance is really just ignoring the history of NATO and what NATO is doing right now. The other thing is it's not just NATO, it's US bases. And the fact that we have 750 plus bases around the world and hundreds of them in Europe, many from the time of the World War II, which they never closed them. Most of those bases and US military still in Germany, in Italy. Like you have bases that were recent ones put in very close to Russia's border. And that is in Romania and in Poland, where there's a new base that is just 100 miles from Russian territory. And so how could that not be a provocation? You think of that in the terms right now of the United States, where we have people like Lindsey Graham who are saying these drug cartels in Mexico is not dealing with it, we should go in and bomb them. And so imagine if Mexico said, uh-oh, you know, the United States is going to come in and bomb us, we better make a military alliance with some other power like Russia or China. And imagine what the United States would do. Of course, it's 200 years now since the Monroe Doctrine was first put into place, saying that the U.S. would not allow any kind of foreign military alliance with any country in all of Latin America. So our backyard extends through the whole continent. So, you know, the U.S. would never allow that kind of provocation on its borders. And then you have the direct U.S. interference in Ukrainian affairs. And that is not something that leftists are making up. That is something that is documented by none other than Victoria Nuland herself, who was Undersecretary of State back in the early, 2013, when she bragged about how the U.S. had already invested $5 billion in building up civil society that would be pro-Western, which means anti-Russian. And so the U.S. was sowing the seeds. And then came 2014, which was the Maidan uprising against a democratically elected government, but a corrupt government, and a government that many people legitimately disliked, and came out in the streets and protested. And those protests grew, and for a long time they were peaceful protests, and then they got violent, not just by the reaction of the government, but also by paramilitary groups that got involved and started taking over. And these we can call neo-Nazi groups, we can call them ultra-nationalist groups, but they turned it from a peaceful protest into a violent coup. And we see Victoria Nuland herself at that time, thanks to the video footage that we have, showing her literally in Maidan Square handing out goodies to the protesters and cheering them on. So imagine January 6th, when there was an attempt to take over the Congress, if there had been somebody from the Russian government who had been out there handing out cookies and said, go overthrow your government, we're with you all the way. These are analogies, I think, that it's fair to make. The other thing is that we have this leaked audio tape of Victoria Nuland when she's talking to the U.S. ambassador in Ukraine, saying who the U.S. wants to see and will make sure is the next head of state of Ukraine, who will be pushed aside because it's better that we have them on the outside. I mean, literally, U.S. government officials deciding who would lead the country of Ukraine. And, you know, the U.S., this isn't the first time that the U.S. has orchestrated coups in other countries, but it takes us a long time to learn the extent of U.S. involvement. And it takes things like Freedom of Information Act requests, it takes whistleblowers that might come out years later, and I'm sure that years from now, we will learn even more about the extent of the U.S. involvement. But we know enough already that the U.S. was intimately involved in turning the government in 2014 from one that was friendly with Russia to one that was anti-Russia. And then because in the eastern part of the country, where there are more Russian speakers, ethnic Russians tend to be more pro-Russian, there was a Gallup poll that was done when that new government came in that showed that over half of the people did not consider that new government legitimate. And if you break it down to the western part of the country that is more pro-Europe, they considered it more legitimate, but the people in the eastern part and in Crimea didn't. And so there was an uprising in the Donbass, and that was the beginning of a civil war. And then Russia came in and took over Crimea because Russia felt that it would not get access to the port, that it was so critical for Russia, and because Crimea had belonged to Russia for 200 years. The majority of people in Crimea are Russian speakers and ethnic Russians. So the civil war goes on from 2014, and the international community comes in and says, we must try to stop this. And so there were talks between Russia and Ukraine that were mediated and guaranteed by some of the countries in Europe, particularly France, Germany, and Poland. And they came up with agreements called the Minsk Accords. And in those agreements, they brought in hundreds of monitors from Europe to be watching what is happening along the border, and that helped to ease some of the fighting. But there was a political part of that Minsk agreement in which there was supposed to be constitutional change, there were supposed to be meetings with the heads of state of the break-off republics, and there was supposed to be autonomy within the nation of Ukraine, autonomy for that region. And that never happened. And I remember when we were writing the book, trying to come up with more of an understanding of why that never happened, in addition to the fact that when there was a head of state of Ukraine, like Zelensky, who ran for president on a peace ticket saying that he was going to implement these accords, he was going to meet with the heads of the breakaway republic, these ultranationalists said, no way you're going to do that. If you do that, you'll find yourself hanging from a tree. But in addition to the threats he was getting from the ultranationalists internally, there was also not a lot of effort on the part of the guarantors to do something about it. And we find out in the last 2 months through interviews that were given by the head of Germany at the time, who was Angela Merkel, and the head of France at that time, who was Francois Hollande, that they said in separate interviews that the Minsk agreements were an opportunity to buy time to get Ukraine weapons and training. And indeed, what we see happening is that immediately after those agreements were signed, you think that would be a time to, focus on getting the agreement implemented. Instead, what did the U.S. and the West do? They started sending weapons into Ukraine. And first, under Obama, they had to be just defensive weapons. But in 2015, and then Trump coming in, they said offensive weapons are okay. And so they started pouring weapons into Ukraine and training 10,000 Ukrainian soldiers every year in an effort to be ready to either take Donbass back by force and Crimea, or to fight a war with Russia, which is happening now. So there was very little effort on the part of the West to get those agreements implemented to stop the Civil War. The Civil War continued. Now, I don't want to say this to justify Russia, but I do want to say that right before the invasion in December of 2021, when things were heating up so much, Russia did put out a proposal to NATO and another one to the US, saying, we better sit down and talk about these issues, and put out a whole bunch of issues to talk about. Some of them that would have been agreeable, including going back to arms agreements with Russia, between the US and Russia, that the US had pulled out of, and some of them more calling about the territorial gains that Russia wanted to make that would not be acceptable. But it was a proposal to sit down and talk, and yet that was rejected. Then the Russians invaded, and that was in February 24th. As we see how they went not only to reinforce the Donbass area, but went towards Kyiv. Obviously, they wanted to take over the government, put a government in place that would be friendly. That didn't happen. There was a lot of resistance, and the Russians had to push back. And now there has been this horrific war with all kinds of horrible consequences for the civilians of Ukraine, horrible consequences for the soldiers on both sides. You see this kind of trench warfare that takes us back to the world wars, with hundreds and hundreds of these young men being killed on a regular basis. And the question really comes up is, where is this going? So there are people who say that this is a winnable war for Ukraine, and that is why the West has to just keep sending in weapons. And yet you get people like Mark Milley, the chair of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, the highest military advisors to President Biden, who says 2 months ago said, hold on, the Ukrainians have done a tremendous job resisting the invasion, but it doesn't look like there will be any military win for either side on the battlefield, and Ukraine is in a good position now to seize the moment and go for negotiations. And yet that has been disregarded by the US government and by all the parties. So if you have generals, not only in the US, but several of them who have come out in Europe to say this is not a winnable war, and depending on what media you look at, some media in the US will say the Ukrainians are winning, just get more of the weapons in there. And if you listen to a more pro-Russian media, you will hear the Russians are winning, we just have to move forward. And yet, if you listen to both sides, maybe you will come to the conclusion that Mark Milley came to, which is there is no winning in the battlefield in this war. The US and the West will keep sending weapons. There will come a time, perhaps, when Zelensky will say, it's not working with weapons, we need troops. And where does that lead us? Into a World War III. And then, of course, there's the issue of nuclear weapons. And, you know, it's astounding to me, given how incredibly dangerous this situation is, how little talk there is in the United States about the possibility of a nuclear war. You hear Biden said it once, not in a policy kind of way. He said it at a fundraiser once. He talked about the possibility of nuclear Armageddon, and he said at that time that Putin needs an off-ramp. And he said Putin needs an off-ramp, but he certainly hasn't offered any kind of off-ramp. And if you think of what happened in 1962 with the Cuban Missile Crisis, when you had Khrushchev and JFK realizing that the fate of the world was in their hands, and they were courageous enough to sit down and negotiate with each other and make a compromise that the Russians would withdraw their missiles from Cuba. And unbeknownst to the American people, until 6 years later, the compromise is that the US would remove its missiles from Turkey. But what JFK said at the time, if you are in a fight with a nuclear country, never leave them with only two options, one a humiliating retreat, and the other is the use of a nuclear weapon. And here you have Biden himself talking about Putin needs an off-ramp, and yet not wanting to offer one. In fact, hiding behind this idea of nothing about Ukraine without Ukraine. We cannot push Zelensky to the negotiating table. And I say that that's absolutely ridiculous, because who is paying the bills? Who is paying for this war? And it's not just the bills for the war. Who is paying the bills to keep the government running in Ukraine? It's the US taxpayers. And it was kind of maybe a slip of tongue for Biden when he was at a press conference once, and he was talking about all the money and all the help we were giving to Ukraine, and he said, we're even paying for the pensions for Ukrainians. And a number of people picked up on that. In fact, there was a congressman who picked up on that and said in one of the hearings, could you tell us exactly how much money we are paying for the pensions of people in Ukraine? Because in my district, people are not getting pensions. So the U.S. is, and we, the taxpayers, have spent over $110 billion for this war so far. And I think that gives us some leverage in where this is going. Well, when it comes to peace talks, the U.S. has not only not pushed for them, but the U.S. has sabotaged them. Well, how do we know that? We know that from a couple of different instances. One is after the war began, there was a tremendous worry coming from the Europeans to say, uh-oh, where is this going? We should try to stop this quickly, because people know that the best time to try to stop a war is in the very early stages. And so there were a number of heads of state who got involved. One of them was the head of state of Italy, the other was from Erdogan from Turkey, and the other, some might think it's quite ironic, but this was Naftali Bennett, who was Prime Minister of Israel at the time. Some might say that he had another conflict that he could have tried to solve that was closer to home, but whatever. The one that had the most success was Erdogan from Turkey. And in this case, thank you. And in this case, there were talks that were going on for quite a number of weeks. And they actually came up with a 12-point peace proposal. And it was going very well. In fact, so well that Zelensky got up in public TV in front of the Ukrainian people to say that the most important thing is peace. And that we might have to forego our dream of trying to join NATO, but we will have powerful guarantors that will make sure that if we are a neutral country, we will not get invaded again, and that I will put forward any negotiations that we come up with to the people to vote on is a referendum. And yet, very quickly after that, the peace talks fell apart. Why did they fall apart? Well, the head of the UK at that time, Boris Johnson, went to meet with Zelensky and said, we don't want you to make an agreement. We want you to fight till victory, and the collective West is behind you in that. And then the head of the U.S. Defense Department, Lloyd Austin, went to meet with Zelensky and said, we have to weaken Russia to make sure they are never able to do anything like this again. And the talks were cut off. The Turkish people who were involved in the talks, not Erdogan, but people under him, said it was the West that sabotaged those talks. That also came out in a anti-Russian newspaper in Ukraine. But people kept arguing with me and saying, I don't believe it, I don't believe it. Then we have another proof that came out recently, and that is Naftali Bennett himself, who in an interview said that he was pushing going back between Kyiv and Moscow, and they were close to a ceasefire, and both sides wanted a ceasefire, but it was stopped by the West. And so there we have another example of how the U.S. has sabotaged peace talks. But we don't have to go back a number of months. We can look right now at the Chinese effort to put forward a peace proposal. Now, in the past, China has been a huge economic powerhouse and has become like the #1 trading partner with countries all over the world, but it hasn't been known as a peacemaker. But we have just last month this incredible deal that the Chinese negotiated between two arch enemies in the Middle East, and that is Saudi Arabia and Iran. And when China was able to broker that deal, a lot of heads of state around the world started looking up and saying, aha, China is playing a new role now. And then China put forward a set of principles for peace in Ukraine. And it put forward those principles and then had a meeting with Putin. And Putin responded positively and said, you know, that is an outline that we can start with to work on. And Zelensky responded positively as well. Guess who didn't? Biden. And the White House and Anthony Blinken was supposed to be our #1 diplomat. And instead of being a diplomat, he has been going around the world trying to gin up more weapons to be sent to Ukraine. So the U.S. has totally poo-pooed this idea of a Chinese peace proposal, but the rest of the world hasn't. In fact, many nations are very excited about the idea of China and other nations playing a role in having a club of nations that come together to play some kind of mediating role. And people who say, you know, it's impossible to talk to Russia, I think they should know that the Ukrainians and Russians are talking on a regular basis on a number of issues. There have been talks about getting the millions of tons of grain out of Ukraine and out of Russia into the world where there's a desperate need for that, and where in the beginning of the war, the prices of wheat and other grains had gone up so much that it was creating hunger in parts of the Middle East and in Africa. And so now those agreements that get re-upped every 3 months or 6 months create corridors, which is very difficult to do, from farms to get the grain out of the country, to get a sea corridor as well. And that has been successfully renegotiated several times. There is also the negotiations when it looked like that #1 nuclear power plant in all of Europe, the Zaporizhia plant, was going to be blown up, and imagine the radiation that would be spread all over Europe. Negotiations to get members of the International Atomic Energy Agency into that plant. It's still very dicey, but the negotiations are happening on a regular basis because both sides don't want to see that plant blown up. And then there are negotiations on prisoner swaps. Raise your hand if you've heard of the prisoner swap with Brittany Griner. So that's the one that Americans know about because that was a high-profile one, and that was between Russia and the U.S. But there are prisoner swaps that are going on a regular basis between Ukraine and Russia. And those are very, very difficult to negotiate. You have to negotiate how many prisoners, which prisoners, how are you going to get them, are you going to trust the other side to come through? And they are negotiated on a regular basis. So there are talks, but not on the big issues of how are we going to solve the war. So that leads us to what can we do? If we think it's important, you know, if I were in Russia, I think I would probably be in jail now for protesting the war, well, I go to jail in the United States too. Well, I was just put in jail for asking Blinken, would he, if he doesn't like the Chinese peace plan, why doesn't he come up with a peace plan? Yes, we were put in jail. But your point is well taken. We'd be in jail for a lot longer time in Russia. And I think that many of us as peace activists would be on the front lines protesting the war if we were in Russia. But we are here in the United States, and it's our job to try to stop the U.S. government from prolonging this war, because it is Ukrainian blood that is being spilled every day, as well as Russian and Ukrainian soldiers' blood being spilled every day. And there are people in our government that seem all too willing to allow this to go on in order to weaken Russia, so that Russia will not be a strong supporter for China when we're ready to take on China, which is a crazy notion in and of itself. But how do we move forward to promote peace? I think that we are in a strange time when it comes to what is happening in Congress. And this is largely because it's a Democrat in the White House. Were it a Republican in the White House, you would have the peace Congress people like Barbara Lee from Oakland, California. You would have the Squad. You would have a lot more Democrats that were with us in a rational call for negotiations. But because it's a Democrat in the White House, it's much harder for them. 30 of them came out with a letter to Biden that didn't say, don't send weapons. It only said, in addition to all the help we are giving to Ukraine, let's also push for peace talks. And they got such incredible pushback from their own party that within 24 hours they rescinded that letter. And only one of them that I know of, Ro Khanna from California, is still willing to say, of course we should be pushing for negotiations. The rest of them are afraid to say anything. In fact, someone I love and appreciate very much, Pramila Jayapal, who is the head of the Progressive Caucus, and is so fantastic on so many domestic issues. It was her letter, and she got really burned for that letter. We were getting our picture taken with her the other day, and somebody had a little sign that just said negotiations. It didn't even say Ukraine, it just said negotiations. And she was like, oh, you're trying to get me in trouble, aren't you? I mean, negotiations has become a dirty word now in the Democratic Party, which is insane. We have the big package of $40 billion that was voted on for Ukraine, and not one Democrat opposed it. And yet there were 57 Republicans in the House and 11 Republicans in the Senate who opposed it. Now you might want to say, well, who are these and what was their real motivation? And that is an important thing to look at. They identify as the extreme right of the Republican Party. They are people that many of us would disagree with on all kinds of issues, and yet they were the ones that voted against this package, and they are the ones that are putting forward resolutions now calling for an audit, wanting to know where all this money and where all these weapons are going, and they're putting forward resolutions that are calling for negotiations. And yet we can't get any Democrats to do the same thing right now. Some of those Republicans are doing it because they want all that money to be going towards the real enemy, which is China. Some of them are saying we should be taking all those weapons and putting them on the border with Mexico to stop the hordes who want to come in and destroy our country. And some of them are doing it because they said we're feeling pressure from our base that doesn't like spending all that money on what they considered a border war in Europe that the Europeans should figure out. And some of them are doing it for legitimate, I would consider legitimate reasons. And we don't really know every single one of those 57, but I want to give you an example of one that I met at a hearing last week in Washington, D.C. And this was not at the hearing where I got up and got arrested because I'd asked Blinken what is his peace plan, but it was at another hearing, and it was Blinken as well. And I was there just listening intently. What are the people in Congress asking? You know, what are their questions? And unfortunately, both Democrats and Republicans, for the Republicans, it's why aren't you sending more weapons? Why aren't you sending them quickly? Why aren't you training them quicker in the use of our Abrams tanks? Why aren't you giving them the F-16s that they're asking for? I mean, it's really pushing Biden to be more aggressive. And on the Democratic side, it's really saying, we think Biden is doing a wonderful job, kind of thing. So there were two Republicans that I thought had very interesting questions. And one of them was asking about Crimea. And he said, is the goal really to take back Crimea? Because I really wonder about that. I think that would lead us to a nuclear war if we're going to try to take back Crimea. So I thought that was some interesting questioning. And then the other was the one that I mentioned, who said, how much are we spending on the pensions? And so I went up to him, I just saw when the hearing ended, and I went up and I said, why are you asking such probing questions like this? Because your colleagues are not doing that. And he said, because I hate war.
Who was it?
And his name is Bruchette, Bruchett. He's from Tennessee, from one of the reddest districts in Tennessee. And not only did he say, I hate war, I started walking with him, and he said, this whole thing is a racket. You should see how many of the people in this committee have stocks in the weapons companies.
Yes.
It gave me chills when he said that. And so I was walking, fast with him, and tell me more. And he said, when I'm back in DC to come in and talk to him. And I certainly will. And I think there are people like that. And it reminded me of this other guy during the Iraq War, who he was a Southern Republican. His name is Walter Jones. And Walter Jones is the one who I thought was the kookiest guy in Congress, because he was the one who said, in the cafeteria of Congress, we cannot sell French fries because the French wouldn't go in with us in the war in Iraq. The French betrayed us, and so we are going to rename them Freedom Fries. Remember that?
Yes.
And he literally it made them take the package that they come in the cafeteria and put Freedom Fries on there. So I thought, this guy's a nutcase. And yet, this is the guy who, in his district, he has a big military base, and a lot of the people in his district were sent off to Afghanistan and Iraq to fight in the war. And he went to every single one of the funerals of the young men who were killed. And he said it turned him around totally. And he became our greatest ally against the war in Iraq. And so you have to think that these are people too. We're so cynical about them, but they're people too, and they can be moved. It takes a lot to move them, and they're often moved by money and the weapons industry. But once in a while, you'll find some gems in there that really are moved by wanting to stop the killing. And so, I think I want to end this on the note of where we stand today. The media has been very one-sided and propagandistic in this, and not giving any legitimacy to Russia having any kind of security interest that should be recognized. And also with this idea that we can keep pouring in weapons and there will be a clear victory for Ukrainians, including taking back Crimea. And yet, the polls have been moving more in the direction of people questioning this war. And you see that the AP poll, the most recent one, only 48% of the American people wanted to continue sending weapons to Ukraine. It didn't mean that the 52% wanted to stop. It was about 29% wanted to stop and the rest didn't know. But they're questioning. And the other thing is that the polls show more and more people wanting to see the U.S. promoting negotiations. And that is a positive thing. It's something that is being taken advantage of by people like Donald Trump, Ron DeSantis, and others in the Republican Party who are positioning themselves now to say this war is a Biden war, and if you vote for me, we'll end the war. So we have to think about how that's going to shape up if this war keeps dragging on at the time of the elections. But the American people are certainly questioning more and more. And the other is what's happening in Europe, because Europeans are really feeling the economic consequences of this war much more than we are here. When they have the sanctions against Russian energy, the energy prices shot way up in Europe. The European governments are wealthy enough to be subsidizing the cost of energy, but those subsidies are about to end. and so they're going to feel it even more. So there are large protests. I mean, the French are protesting all kinds of things, so, they're out in the streets. But in Italy, in the Czech Republic, in the UK, there's a lot of protests going on. And the last thing is to say the Global South. And I think what is happening now is reorienting the entire global map. This is like tectonic shifts that are happening. And we don't know how this is going to all play out, but it's happening very quickly. And the Global South, where the majority of people in the world live, are really not wanting to take sides in this. They are saying this is affecting our people with inflation. It's affecting our people in terms of access to food and energy. It's taking the attention of the world away from the real existential crisis we face, which is the climate, and we need to put our resources, our energies into that, and we can't do it while this war is going on. The countries of the Global South are putting a lot of pressure to try to come up with a solution. And so I want to end by quoting somebody from the Global South that I think really reflects that sentiment, and that is the president of Brazil, Lula, who met with Biden a couple of weeks ago, and Biden had been pushing Brazil to send weapons to Ukraine. And what Lula said is, we don't need to send more weapons. What we need are interlocutors who will tell the Russians what a horrible mistake they made by invading Ukraine, and will tell the Ukrainians how important it is that they go to the negotiating table. And he said, we don't want to join this war, we want to end this war. And I think that's the sentiment of the world right now. And he is the one who said we want to create a peace club of nations that can get together and really put pressure on all of the parties involved to come to an end. So when we feel that we are lonely, lone voices here in this country, remember we're part of a much bigger global community that is really desperate to see an end to this war and all wars. Thank you.
We'll have some time for questions and answers, some Q&A. But I would like first to make a little pitch for donations, because what I'd like to do is say how valuable this talk is. I've got a quote here that I want to read you, and I just got a few words that I wanted to address. And this is from Mickey Huff. He's from the Project Censor, if you know what that is. And he's talking about reporters. He says, you're not allowed to ask the tough questions. He says, anybody who's been in the press pool long enough knows that. They don't have to be told that. The censorship doesn't have to be directly from the government or even from the corporate owners. Reporters know that if they ask questions that don't get answered too often and get overlooked, they're going to get yanked. They're going to get called back to the office. They might end up losing their job because they don't have copy and they don't have stories. Right? So he calls this censorship by proxy. So today we're very blessed and honored to have Medea be able to come and tell us what's going on. Right? So the book is available for $20 back there. We have some little receptacles for donations. What I like to think about is like a chorus of voices. They say that money talks, and also that actions speak louder than words, right? So that's why I do a lot of volunteering, and that. So if you can, whatever you can do for Medea, for the Denver Justice and Peace Committee, as well as the Rocky Mountain Peace and Justice organization, right? For all the peace work, if you could help out with some donations, we'll pass that on. So now some Q&A, huh? Yes. And right here, how about Diane? You want to go first?
Do you think Americans have lost their understanding of nuclear war and what it will bring to the world?
Absolutely. I talk in colleges a lot. Really like talking in colleges. And I get blank stares when I talk about nuclear war. And, they have no concept of what it could be, of the danger of it. And so I try to put it more in terms of the environment. What is a nuclear winter? What would it be like if you were unable to see the sun, if you were unable to grow crops, and the kind of famine that would come from that? And I think talking in environmental terms, because that's what young people do understand and are really concerned about, makes it a lot more real to people. But yes, I think you are right. Even though the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists now put the doomsday clock at 90 seconds to midnight, I don't think that resonates with most people.
Well, I got to thinking about it when I heard the song Seeds of Destruction on the radio last week. And it's like, this really relates to me, but I don't know how many other people have even heard it or know about nuclear war.
Yeah. Let's see now,
So, what should we do? Is Congress our target? Is the president our target? What do you, as media, our target?
yeah.
What do you think?
All of them. I think the Congress, I know that your groups meet with Congress on a regular basis, and I heard that the moderate Republicans are going to be putting out a letter, and they're going to frame it in terms of this is hurting our military preparedness because we're sending all our weapons overseas, something like that. But they're going to frame it however they're going to frame it. But what they're trying to do is take it away from the hands of the Marjorie Taylor Greenes and the Lauren Boeberts and the Matt Gaetz and put it more in the more moderate Republicans. I think that since we're having such a hard time with the more progressive Democrats, and since they got burned, we've got to go to the more moderate Democrats as well and say to them that this is going to hurt the Democratic Party. And what is the harm in calling for negotiations? I mean, I think it's too much to ask them at this point to say don't send more weapons, because they're not going to respond to that. But some of us will say that, but if you really want them to have some kind of letter that they would circulate or some kind of statement that they would make, it would be going back to the very, very mild letter that the progressive Democrats wrote. And you could go back and see the wording of it. I mean, it was so fawning over Biden and over all that we were giving to Ukraine that Veterans for Peace wouldn't sign on to it, Code Pink wouldn't sign on to it, a lot of groups wouldn't. But we knew that was the best we were going to get from them. So I think if you go back and you look at that letter and you ask your congressperson, what is wrong with that? Why can't you recirculate that coming maybe from more of the mainstream of the Democratic Party?
And let me just say, when our team went to see Lauren Boebert right after her election, she was willing and did vote to repeal the 2002 authorization for the use of military force because she didn't really know anything. She just needed to be educated, and she was preventing a Democratic president from using military force. So, as a Republican, she was happy to prevent a Democrat.
And she's been one of the best ones on Ukraine.
We can't write people off.
Right, no. She's been one of the best on Ukraine. She signed on to this, I hate the name of it. It's a Matt Gaetz one. I hate the name because I think it really is offensive to the Ukrainian people. It's called the Ukraine Fatigue Act. We're tired of supporting this war. But she was one of the first signers onto that act. And the bad thing about that one is not only is the name so demeaning, but it also says no economic aid. And I don't think we want to say that. So, we went into the office of the people who signed and said, if you want to get more signers and be taken seriously, you have to take that off. We can't have sent all these weapons and blown up all this stuff, and then we say, okay, we're not going to help with economic aid, and we're not going to give humanitarian aid. So you might want to talk to her about that, because it would be good if they changed the wording on that. And, put something forward that was a little more respectful of the Ukrainian people.
I don't know how familiar you are with the Ukrainian pacifist movement. I was reading a lot about them at the front end of the war, and it seemed like that they had some pretty sophisticated, pretty strategic strategies for opposing this war without taking up weapons. And I always wonder if we had fed all the money we've sent to Ukraine into that movement, not that there wouldn't be casualties, but if we had sent to let them do this strategic, resourceful, creative, sophisticated, non-cooperation and non-violent resistance, that we would be in a totally different place. And the Senate's misfired, but maybe you could just comment on that.
No, you're absolutely right, and there were incredible examples from early on of non-cooperation, and there are some wonderful materials that our friends in Ukraine who are part of the pacifist movement or conscientious objectors movement have put out of all the kinds of things that were happening and could have happened.
And it's the
It should have
UPM, it has a name, the UPM, Ukrainian Pacifist Movement.
Yeah, no, we are in touch with them on a regular basis, extremely supportive of their efforts, as well as the efforts of the conscientious objectors, of course, in Russia, as well as in Ukraine. And yes, it is very sad to think of what could have been if we had supported those nonviolent efforts instead of going the way of militarization.
I would like to answer you a bit more than that. Pacifist movements are very important and very good, but when you deal with totalitarian regimes, for them it is meaningless. They see it as weakness, as nothing. So, yeah, if it's countries that are democratic, that is the first solution. But when you have the totalitarian, it will go nowhere. Now, regarding to the other thing about nuclear, of course it's very fragile, nuclear. But the whole world has today nuclear. So everybody say, wait, you use it, I will use it too. So actually it will be the end of the world. Nobody wants the end of the world. So I think it's merely war, it's no more than that.
Well, the U.S. used nuclear weapons.
Sorry?
The U.S. has used nuclear weapons. It's not like they've never been used.
I think that today we live in a world that nobody really wants to use it because they know what are the consequences for everybody, not only for the American or for the other side.
Do you think that Putin would agree to leave Crimea? Give
That's
it back to
what
Ukraine?
I want to come and say now. He has Crimea now, he has Crimea. And even he has Crimea, he wanted more. That is a fact, because he had Crimea already 2 years. Apparently nobody did anything about it. It was like de facto that he had Crimea. And still he wanted to continue further. And we should also remember that under international law, from the Second World War, you cannot go and invade other parts of the world. That is set up after the Second World War, that no more invasions of other parts.
Yeah, so unfortunately, the U.S. did not listen to that for many invasions.
Yeah, but we have to strive, we have to
Yes,
strive.
we have to strive, absolutely.
That because that is a good idea. NATO is also.
So, I'm sorry, do you have a question?
I would like to say something about NATO on that one.
Oh.
You said that NATO at the beginning should not exist. I think that it was created to deter large countries like the United States and Russia to go and invade other small countries that cannot fight this kind of war. And I think that NATO should extend it to the whole world, that nobody is going to fight others because the other part is going after them, and even if it's a small country. And to say that we don't need it, I think NATO can be a deterrent and is a deterrent. But they talk only about Europe, more or less.
So, okay, well, thank you for that. I just want to respond by saying that the reason that NATO was not disbanded was because the U.S. wanted to keep Russia within the U.S. sphere and not see Russia get close to, I wanted to see Europe within the U.S. sphere and not see Europe get close to Russia. And I think that we have seen the consequences of that, and that a military alliance that is controlled by the United States is not one that brings security for the world. We've seen in the last 20 years all of the upheavals. I mean, just passing 20 years and looking at Iraq today, and all of the civilian casualties, all of the refugees, to say that the U.S. and NATO have somehow brought peace and security to the world doesn't reflect
Because
the
they take
reality.
only care of Europe, that's the truth. They do it only for Europe.
Let's see, we have two questions here.
Yeah, I'm just curious, are we aware that Crimea was Russian territory? How many of you know that Crimea was a Russian territory? And that there was election, Crimean people who voted that they want to be part back of Russia.
Right.
And the strategic point of Crimea, that it's so close to Russia, it's in Black Sea, that Russia never will send its territory to be under Ukraine, because we know what can happen in Ukraine with American military bases and weapons there so close. I'm from Bulgaria. In my country, we have NATO camps, military, that nobody can go there because they're just allowed for the militaries. The population doesn't know what happens in that NATO camps. That's
Absolutely. I mean, the fact that the U.S. has nuclear weapons in 5 European countries, and the fact that there are so many countries in which there are protests against U.S. bases, and that yet the U.S. refuses to leave those bases.
Yeah, thank you. First, I just want to thank you so much for being here. I followed your work and Coach's work for decades, and I was so relieved to see you all come out for peace right at the beginning of this Ukraine debacle, because you've always been on the right side of history. And thank you so much for making this speaking tour, because we are so inundated with corporate media propaganda, which I believe is funneled by the military-industrial complex, that's influenced by the military-industrial complex, and it's very hard and very difficult to be a voice for peace right now. So thank you for standing up to Blinken last week. I watched you do that, and I was like, go, Medea, go. And I guess my question, first I just want to say, I'm an independent journalist. I've done hundreds of hours of research on this Ukraine issue. I have a podcast called Crawdads and Taters, Red State Rebels. It's on Apple, Spotify, and we play a lot of the clips that she's been talking about, a lot of the voice clips of Victoria Nuland and Joe Biden when he was setting up his relationship with Poroshenko to take over Ukraine. There's a lot of really interesting audio clips in there, so I'd encourage you to go listen to it and hear it from the lion's mouth.
What was the name again?
Crawdads and Taters.
Crawdads
Red
and
State
taters.
Yeah, I have a flyer. Buy her book, first buy her book. But anyway, my question is, why do you think that the media propaganda, from my perspective, is so much worse than it was even in the Iraq War and an Iraq invasion. And I know that Anthony Blinken was a lobbyist for the military-industrial complex before he stepped into this position in the State Department. And I know that Lloyd Austin was on the board of Raytheon. It doesn't take too much to figure out who's driving this war, but it's incredible to me that when you have Mark Milley, head of the Pentagon, saying, no, let's exercise restraint, and then you have the State Department, who's supposed to be diplomats, pushing for war, like something has gone terribly awry here. And what do you think are the main motivators behind what's driving this State Department?
Well, you know that Blinken did have a meeting with Lavrov. Do you know how long it lasted? 10 minutes. A 10-minute meeting with him. That's in this entire time.
Wow.
And yes, he came from West End Strategies, that it was a lobby group to get massive contracts from the Pentagon. He was an assistant to Biden when Biden was pushing his policies around Ukraine. And for what I think, might as well be part of the Pentagon. I mean, he does not act like a diplomat. And there was just an interesting piece in the New York Times by a guy named Trita Parsi. And he said that the U.S. used to be involved in making peace deals. He brought up the Camp David Accords. He brought up the peace deal in Northern Ireland. And he said, you know, the U.S. has not been able in decades now to negotiate peace because it always takes a side. And it always takes a side, and this isn't what Trita said, this is what I say now, it always takes a side because it wants to arm a side, because it makes money by arming a side.
Yep.
And that's what we've become. We've become a country where it's like, this is good, this is evil, there's nothing in between. We're going to arm the good, and we're going to fight the evil. And, you know, it takes to such absurdities that in the war in Yemen, we say the good is Saudi Arabia. And we're arming Saudi Arabia to bomb the poorest people in the Arab world. And somehow, you know,
Because
So-
Iran is on the other side.
because, yeah, Iran is on the other side and they're the bad. So, what is it? I think there's a massive amount of money involved. And when you look at this Pentagon budget, it is very close to $1 trillion now. And it's over half of the discretionary funds that we spend. And we have been taken over by the neocons, who are in control of our foreign policy, whether it's a Democrat or a Republican in Congress. And we've been taken over by what General Eisenhower warned us about back in the 60s, by the military-industrial congressional complex.
And we're kicking people off of Medicare.
And we're kicking people off of Medicare, and we're cutting food subsidies to people who are hungry.
She has another
Do you
question.
really want to double it?
I think.
What did you say about
They want to double the military budget, make it close to $2 trillion. I heard that today. I'm trying to find out exactly where it came from.
Well, no, they're not gonna double it. They've increased it
No,
to.
well, this is the whole projection because of China.
Oh, yeah.
Medea.
Well, we had somebody in the back there who.
I was just gonna ask, do you think, the level of propaganda and censorship for this war is worse than, say, the Iraq War and other wars? Because it seems like, I mean, the propaganda might be the same level, but then you have this other level of censorship and neo-McCarthyism with always accusing someone of being, like, if I make the points you're making, people think I'm pro-Putin. Like that's.
Yeah. No, it's horrific, and I think you really are stating why, because there is this, for an older generation, there's the whole Cold War, hate Russia, and then for the newer generation, there's the Russiagate, that Russia's responsible for Trump winning the election because Hillary Clinton was such a great candidate and she should have won. Yeah, I mean, that all builds up to that anything you do to even try to put the context in, not to forgive Russia, makes you a Putin apologist. And just to say something on the censorship issue, well, you know, if you're Ukraine or Russia, obviously there's censorship in your country. Wherever there's war, there's terrible censorship. But here in this country, the censorship is keeping the voices that voice things like I'm saying out of the mainstream media. And we've seen that all along in this war. And, you know, I rewrite everything I write, making it as bland as could be, and try to get it in a major newspaper, and I cannot get it in. And Jeffrey Sachs, who some of you might know, who's brilliant on this and says, you know, he wrote for the Washington Post and the New York Times for 40 years. He can't get an op-ed in and can't get on television. And so, you know, there is tremendous censorship right now.
Two questions, Judy and then Tom.
Well, mine you've kind of addressed, but I'm very concerned because I feel like we Americans are on parallel tracks with getting our information, and the tracks never cross. And I feel like people who read the New York Times, for instance, you cannot talk to them about any of this because they insist that that the New York Times is right and you're wrong. And granted, I could be wrong, but I feel like our country is getting even more divided because of the way the media keeps putting out separate but unequal, separate and opposite opinions.
Yeah, but now we're not divided left and right like it used to be a little easier to divide. Now, it's so funny, a friend of mine just said, did you hear Trump? He said if he wins the election, before he gets to the White House, he will call his two good friends, Zelensky and Putin, and he will make peace. He said, she said, oh my God, I can't believe I'm gonna have to vote for Trump. I mean, you know, we're being divided now in all kinds of other ways, Tom.
I think there are two major reasons why the media is more monolithic in this war than the previous one. One is that we're up against a serious competitor, Russia, China, as in the Ukraine, and we were not up against a really serious competitor in the Iraq War or in the Afghanistan War. The second reason is that the U.S. position as the global hegemon is slipping. And I think that it is much less secure than it has been in the past. And thus it feels in a position of weakness and much more defensive. That's one reason why I think the media is so more monolithic in this war than in the previous wars.
We have two questions after your short response.
Well, I was gonna end on that, but if we have two questions, maybe we should take them now and then I'll wrap up.
Actually, three
I
questions.
can wait. I can talk to her after.
Okay.
And I have a question too. So why don't you go first?
In general terms, beyond Ukraine, do you have any thoughts on how or why the United States public in general got so divorced from foreign policy in the United States? People seem so oblivious to what the United States government does in so many places.
Well, foreign policy has never been of great interest to people in the United States. I mean, we're concerned about the things that affect our daily lives. You know, we see police killing young black people in the streets, and we say we've got to get out on the street and do something about that. We see that our young people can't afford to go to college, and we got to do something about it. We see we can't afford, you know, we can't get decent health care. We got to do something. So, you know, there's a lot of reasons that we're focused on domestic issues, but then on top of that, the U.S. is such an ignorant country when it comes to foreign policy issues. You know, we're such a big country. Most people in this country don't have passports. They've never traveled outside the United States. The world is the United States. USA, best country in the world. When you've never traveled outside to another country, but, you know, we're still the best country in the world. So there's a lot of that, you know, that all wrapped up together. And when you see that people put around election time, what are their most important issues? Foreign policy is always down at the bottom. I mean, if it even appears. So it's just, and then that means for politicians, it's better for them to not stick their necks out on foreign policy issues. So you see all these wonderful, people in Congress who are really good, right there with us on a number of issues. They don't want to say a word about this. And, it's not just this issue. Take an issue like Cuba, where the U.S. is just doing a brutal, brutal thing against the Cuban people right now. Horrible, horrible policy that Biden is doing that's following Trump's policy instead of following Obama's policy. And yet, we can get a handful of people to say, this is not good. It's just not worth their while. They don't get any benefit from it. And then think the diaspora, the people in this country that come from other countries, first generation or just came, they tend to be very conservative. So whether it's Cuban Americans, Venezuelan Americans, Ukrainian Americans, Russian, whatever it is, they tend to be very conservative. And they tend to be very passionate. And so if you're going to go up against a policy that they're not going to like, they're going to come down on you. And I was told by Pramila Jayapal from the Progressive Caucus, she said, the Ukrainian Americans are organizing you 10 to 1.